This story took place approximately 10 years ago. I spent most of my childhood in a relatively small house, sharing a bedroom with my older brother. Our room contained two twin beds on opposite sides, two dressers, and two closets, leaving no space for a desk. While not overly cramped, it wasn't particularly spacious either. When my brother left for college, I immediately took advantage of the newly available space. With his permission, I moved his bed out of the room, effectively claiming the area for myself. At that age, having a desk in my bedroom was essential, so it was a welcome change from doing homework in the basement or my dad's upstairs office. This arrangement worked perfectly for 2 years, until I also went off to college, at which point living at home was no longer a factor. After graduating, my brother secured a city job in our hometown, leading him to move back into our parents' house. The first thing he did, as you might guess, was reclaim the bedroom I had spent months diligently redesigning. Initially, I was annoyed, but my parents reminded me that I had done something similar to him, so I accepted it as fair. After graduating, I secured a city job and decided to move back in with my parents, following my brother's lead. However, my old room was no longer available. The only other option was the upstairs guest bedroom. Though it was half the size of my previous room, it would suffice. This guest room was adjacent to my dad's office, the only other room on that floor. It was also directly above the garage, meaning the entire floor would vibrate for 10 seconds every time the garage door was activated. The room, situated on a corner, slightly overhung the house, featuring two windows on intersecting walls, one overlooking the driveway and the other a side of the house. It wasn't ideal, but it was private and usually quiet. This particular incident occurred on a Friday evening when I was home alone. My brother was at a work conference in Baltimore, and my parents were spending the night at our family shore house, as they often did on summer weekends. After an exhausting day at work, I decided to stay in, order food, and have an early night around 11:30 p.m. I was in bed, reading a book, trying to unwind. The house was completely silent, a pleasant change from its usual chaos when everyone was home. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of the garage door beginning to open, followed by the familiar floor vibration I'd grown accustomed to. It took a few seconds for the realization to sink in. None of my family should have been home. My parents had explicitly stated they were staying at the shore house until Sunday night, and my brother wasn't due back until Saturday afternoon. It took several seconds for that realization to fully sink in, but when it did, my heart started racing. I immediately jumped out of bed and looked out the window toward the driveway, but it was too dark to make out anything. Clearly I could see that the garage door was open, but I couldn't tell if there was a car inside or who might have opened it without another thought. I found a baseball bat in the closet, one my parents had kept from my childhood. As I crept downstairs, I tried to rationalize the garage door opening. Perhaps my parents had returned for something they'd forgotten, or my brother's plans had changed. Maybe the door had even malfunctioned. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, just before the turn into the main part of the house, I heard faint voices coming from the bedrooms. They were too quiet to understand, but I could distinguish at least two people talking. At that moment, I knew for certain someone had broken in. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address and explaining that our house was being burglarized. I left the call active and put the phone back in my pocket. As instructed, the operator told me to stay hidden, but an overwhelming urge to defend my home compelled me to act, rather than just waiting. So against the operator's instruction, I decided that's exactly what I was going to do. I crept down the hallway toward the voices, clutching the baseball bat as tightly as I could. As I got closer to my parents' bedroom. I could hear the sounds of drawers being opened and things being moved around. They were clearly searching for something valuable. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to do was probably stupid, but unable to stop myself, I started yelling as loudly as I could to catch them off guard, then charged into the room with a baseball bat raised above my head. There were two men rummaging through my mother's closet, and they both yelled out in shock.
When I burst through the door, I could tell they hadn't expected anyone to be home, let alone someone willing to fight back. That gave me confidence despite the fact that I was outnumbered and they could have easily had weapons of their own. I swung the bat at the closer of the two men connecting with his leg.
He cursed and hobbled a few steps before falling over. I turned to the other one, but before I could get a clean swing at him, he dropped his shoulder and tackled me before I could react. The two of us hit the ground hard, and I immediately realized that this guy was significantly larger and stronger than me. He wrestled the bat out of my hands without much effort and got his hands around my throat and started choking me. I was fighting for my life, clawing at his hands and trying to get him off of me, when I saw the first guy crawling towards us. He had something in his hand that looked like a knife, and in that moment, I realized I'd made a grave mistake by trying to play hero, a mistake that was going to cost me my life. I genuinely thought those might be the final moments of my life. I started accepting that I was going to die in my parents' bedroom, and all I could think about was how devastated my mom would be when she found out. But then, in the background, I heard the faint sound of police sirens approaching. The last thing I remember is the second guy picking up my baseball bat and swinging it at my head. Everything went black after that. When I woke up, someone was shaking me gently. I opened my eyes to see a police officer kneeling beside me, asking if I was okay. I was dazed and confused, and it took me several seconds to remember what had happened. I looked around the room and saw that the door connecting my parents' bedroom to the backyard was wide open. The intruders had clearly knocked me out and fled through the back when they heard the sirens. The officer told me to stay put and not to move too much in case I was concussed or had other injuries. I had a raging headache, but I was conscious and coherent, which seemed like a good sign. Once the paramedics confirmed that I was okay, I refused to go to the hospital despite their recommendations. I gave the officers a detailed account of what happened. They told me they were currently searching the neighborhood for suspects, but by the time they'd arrived, the men were already long gone. After the police finished their investigation and took some photos of the scene, I called my parents and brother to let them know what had happened. My parents yelled at me pretty harshly for being stupid enough to confront those guys, and I deserved it, had I just done the smart thing and hid. There's a good chance the police would have been able to apprehend the perps. The men were never found, despite the police canvassing the neighborhood and following up on a few leads. My parents installed the comprehensive security system the moment they got back from the shore house, complete with cameras, motion sensors, lights, the whole nine. The days after the break-in, something kept bothering me about the whole situation. All the doors to my house were locked that night, and the only way to open the garage door was through a little button in my car that my dad had programmed to be a wireless switch. There was no way anyone would just stumble upon it. Whoever had broken in that night had known me or my family well enough to know where that button was. Up until that moment, I never locked my car when it was in the driveway either. So that's something the culprits would have had to know as well. Even more concerning was the timing. They somehow knew that my parents would be away for the weekend, that my brother was out of town. I don't live in that house anymore, but my parents were never able to determine who had broken in. I truly believed those were my final moments. I braced myself for death in my parents' bedroom, my only thought being my mother's devastation. Then, faintly in the background, I heard police sirens approaching. The last thing I remember is the second intruder picking up my baseball bat and swinging it at my head. Everything went black. When I awoke, someone was gently shaking me. I opened my eyes to see a police officer kneeling beside me, asking if I was okay, dazed and confused. It took me a few seconds to recall what had happened. I looked around and saw the door connecting my parents' bedroom to the backyard was wide open. The officer explained that the intruders had clearly knocked me out and fled through the back when they heard the sirens. He told me to stay put, in case I had a concussion or other injuries. I had a pounding headache, but was conscious and coherent, which seemed like a good sign. Once the paramedics confirmed I was okay, I refused to go to the hospital despite their recommendations. I gave the officers a detailed account of what happened. They informed me they were searching the neighborhood for suspects, but by the time they arrived, the men were long gone. After the police finished their investigation and took photos, I called my parents and brother to tell them. My parents harshly reprimanded me for confronting the intruders, and I deserved it. Had I simply hidden, there's a good chance the police would have apprehended them. The men were never found, despite police canvassing the neighborhood and following up on leads. My parents installed a comprehensive security system, complete with cameras, motion sensors and lights, the moment they returned from their shore house. In the days after the break-in, something about the situation continued to bother me. All the doors to my house were locked that night, and the only way to open the garage door was through a small button in my car that my dad had programmed as a wireless switch. There was no way anyone would simply stumble upon it. Whoever broke in that night must have known me or my family well enough to know where that button was. Until that moment, I had never locked my car when it was in the driveway either, so the culprits would have had to know that as well. Even more concerning was the timing. They somehow knew my parents would be away for the weekend, and that my brother was out of town. I no longer live in that house, but my parents were never able to determine who had broken in. It was actually something that made my dad really paranoid for a long time, since he too thought that whoever had broken in was close to the family in some way. I am not going to go as far as to say that night changed me forever or anything cliché like that, but I will say one thing. Life before and after you've accepted you're going to die are two very different things. I can still remember that feeling of thinking that it was the end for me. It just felt so dissociating. Nothing can replicate that feeling. This happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still shaken up by how calculated and personal the whole thing was. I had recently moved back to my hometown to help care for my aging mother, who lives about 20 minutes away from me. I found this small duplex that was perfect for my situation, close enough to get to her quickly if needed, but far enough that I still had my own space and independence.
My mom has been having some health issues lately, nothing life-threatening, but she's had a few minor falls around the house, and she's stubborn about accepting help. I've been trying to convince her to get one of those medical alert systems, but she insists she doesn't need one, and that I'm just being overprotective.
It's been a constant source of stress for me, especially knowing that she's alone most of the time on this particular evening. I was just settling in for the night. It was around 9:11 p.m., and I was on the couch watching TV when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number that I didn't recognize, but since I was still relatively new to the area, I figured it might be important and answered. The woman on the other end identified herself as a nurse at a local emergency room. She said my mother had been brought in about an hour ago after taking a fall and hitting her head, according to her. My mom was conscious, but asking for me, and they wanted to know if I could get to the hospital quickly. I was horrified. This was exactly the kind of call I'd been dreading since moving back. I didn't doubt the legitimacy of the call for 1 second. The woman on the other end knew my mother's full name, her address, and even mentioned her recent hip replacement surgery from a few months ago. I immediately stopped what I was doing, trying to keep calm and level myself by saying a silent prayer. I didn't even think about locking up the house. I just grabbed my keys, pulled the front door shut behind me, and raced to my car. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare. I kept running through scenarios in my head, and only a few of them were remotely good. When I got to the ER, I rushed up to the reception desk and told them I was there for my mother. I gave them her name and said I'd received a call about her fall. The nurse looked confused and checked her computer, then told me there was no record of anyone by that name being admitted or treated that evening. I insisted there had to be some mistake since I had just gotten a call from someone claiming to be a nurse there. The receptionist was sympathetic, but firm. They had no record of my mother being brought in, and they suggested I try calling her directly to make sure she was okay. So that's what I did. I stepped outside and called my mom's landline, and she answered. She said she'd been sleeping and wanted to know why I was calling so late. I decided against scaring her, so I simply told her I was checking in and to go back to bed. It was then that the chilling realization struck me. I had been set up. Someone had intentionally fed me false information to lure me out of my house. Furious at how easily I'd been tricked, I jumped back into my car. Upon pulling into my driveway, the front door was still closed, exactly as I'd left it. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was being paranoid and nothing had actually happened. But the instant I stepped inside, I knew I'd been robbed. The house was completely ransacked. My TV, laptop, and small jewelry collection from my bedroom were all gone. As I inspected further, I noticed the thieves had also taken some truly bizarre items. Family photos were missing from their frames. Not the frames themselves, just the actual pictures. My prescription bottles from the bathroom medicine cabinet had been emptied and taken. It was insane. They had taken things that had relatively little monetary value, yet huge sentimental value. To me, it was sadistic. I'm telling you, there's no reason a thief would ever take them, only photos. There just isn't. I called the police immediately, but I was already feeling defeated at that point. Deep down, I knew the thieves were long gone, and there was nothing I could do about it. I told the police everything. I remembered the phone call verbatim, and after hearing it, the police reached the same conclusion I had. Whoever had been on the other end had known things about my mother and I that no stranger could possibly know for the life of me.
I couldn't even come up with a list of people who would have that information, or even ways that someone could have gotten that information in the first place.
The officers told me to feel free to call back whenever I had something concrete. Then they left. I was utterly baffled. Just imagine how unsettled you'd feel if some stranger knew enough about you to lure you out of your house. The theft itself was bad enough, but the fact that they targeted family photos and medical information suggested it wasn't just about quick cash. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning something longer term, possibly identity theft or some other scheme that required personal documentation. But over the next few weeks, nothing else happened. Even though my mother, quote, can't remember who she might have talked to about her personal info, I'm pretty confident that she's the source of the leak. She surprisingly has a lot of friends. For a woman her age, and knowing her, she probably said too much to the wrong person. I've warned my mother about that very thing, and she's finally agreed to be more careful about who she gives personal information to. But I can't shake the feeling that we're still being watched by someone who knows way too much about our lives and isn't finished with whatever they're planning either way. Recently got a Ring camera, so hopefully that's enough of a deterrent. If anything else happens, I'll send it. I am a single guy in my early 30s and I've been living alone in this rented house for over a year now. It's a nice little place in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it's comfortable, and the rent is reasonable. I've gotten into a good routine here, and really feel like I've made it my home. The incident happened on a Thursday night, around 11:30.
I was getting ready for bed when I heard aggressive pounding on my front door. Not knocking, but actual pounding, like someone was trying to break it down. I looked out the window, but couldn't see much because of how poorly the porch light is positioned, despite not being able to see who it was and the aggressiveness of the knocking.
I'm a pretty buff guy, so I wasn't scared or anything more, so irritated and confused. I opened the front door, careful to keep the screen door shut as an added layer of protection. I'm not sure what I was expecting to see, but what I did see was surprising, to say the least. There was this extremely agitated man standing there. He looked to be maybe a few years older than me. He was average height, had disheveled hair, and was wearing clothes that looked like they had been slept in multiple nights in a row. But what caught my attention was how angry and unstable he seemed. His eyes were darting around, and he was breathing heavily like he'd been running or was having some kind of panic attack. He was also pacing around like he couldn't keep his feet on the ground. Before I could even ask what he wanted, he started yelling that this was his house and demanding that I let him in. He said I was trespassing and that he was going to call the police if I didn't get out immediately. I thought he was either on drugs or having some kind of mental health crisis, or me, or a combination of the two. I tried to calm him down and explained that he had the wrong house, but he became even more agitated. That's when he started rattling off details about the house that made me freeze up. I don't even remember everything he said, but he knew several things about the house that you couldn't observe from outside. He described details only an occupant would know, such as the master bedroom door hitting the toilet and the back door sticking, requiring a slight lift to open. I can't recall the other specifics. I was speechless, rooted in shock, but the encounter was far from over. It was about to get considerably stranger. Through the screen door, he produced a folder filled with documents. He presented what appeared to be a lease agreement, bearing his name and dated roughly 6 months before my move-in. He also had mail addressed to him at this residence. Everything seemed legitimate, though I suspected forgery. The most disturbing moment was when he showed me photos on his phone. They were pictures of him inside my house, sitting on my current couch, watching TV, cooking in the kitchen, and even lying in what is now my bedroom. The photos looked recent and completely legitimate. They weren't obviously photoshopped or staged, and most of them weren't solo. They had other people in them, all of whom I'd never seen before. He showed me one photo that he claimed was from this past 4th of July, just a few months ago. It was a selfie taken by a woman I didn't recognize in it. The woman, him, and a few other people were facing the camera and smiling at the kitchen table. There was a box of fireworks off to the side, and the detail and context of the picture made it look completely authentic. That's when I genuinely started questioning my own memory and sanity. How could this person have all this evidence if they never lived here? I started wondering if I somehow blot out memories of sharing the house with someone, and if I was the one having some kind of psychological breakdown. It was freaky, especially since I knew for a fact that I had been home on the 4th of July, so the pictures made even less sense. The whole situation was so surreal that I told them I was going to call the police to sort everything out, not even in an antagonistic way. I just didn't know what else to do. I figured they could check the records and determine what was going on, but the moment I mentioned calling the cops, the guy's demeanor changed completely. He suddenly became very calm and said he'd wait outside while I made the call. Then he just walked away from the door and disappeared into the darkness. I watched from the window, but I couldn't see where he went. When the police arrived, about 10 minutes later, I explained the whole bizarre situation. They told me I should try reaching out to my landlord to get in contact with the previous tenants, and that I might get some answers that way. I had all the required documentation proving I was renting this house, but when I offered to show it to them, they waved it off. They said whoever had been on my doorstep was probably just going through a mental episode, and as long as they were gone, I should just carry on with my life. Then they left. I wasn't just going to sit there and be satisfied with that, though. Whether or not that guy had left still left the question of how in the world he had all that evidence. With my landlord's help, I was eventually able to get in contact with the previous tenants. I should mention that my landlord had no idea what had happened either, and said he didn't know anyone matching that guy's description and had never rented to anyone like that. But anyway, the old tenants also had no idea who I was talking about. They said they'd never lived with anyone matching his description, and they'd lived in the house alone for 3 years before moving out. They were just as confused as I was about how this stranger could have such detailed knowledge of the house and apparently legitimate photos of himself inside of it. For the next 2 weeks, I was constantly on edge, but nothing happened, and I started to think that maybe it had just been some elaborate scam that had failed. But of course, that turned out to be mostly wishful thinking. One night I came home from a night on the town with my friends to find my house completely ransacked. It wasn't like a typical burglary where someone grabs obvious valuables and runs. The place was completely turned upside down, like someone had been looking for something specific. What that thing was, I had no idea. The craziest part is that most of my electronics and other valuable items were still there, despite the fact that the rooms they were in were completely trashed. The absence of forced entry suggested the intruder possessed a copy of my key. This, coupled with the strange incident from 2 weeks prior, strongly indicated the same individual was responsible. This time, both the police and my landlord took the situation with greater seriousness.
My landlord promptly replaced all the locks in the house, free of charge, and installed additional security measures.
The prevailing theory, and one I subscribe to, is that a delusional individual believes they reside in my house and broke in to search for personal belongings.
While this is problematic, it fails to explain how they obtained my documentation, let alone literal copies of my house key.
I regret not examining this so-called lease agreement more closely. I might have identified him. At the time, my thoughts were muddled. The documents themselves don't bother me much, as they, along with the alleged mail, could easily have been forged or altered. What truly terrifies me are the pictures. I have no logical explanation for them. While they could be old and the dates doctored, that still doesn't clarify why my landlord, who has owned the house his entire life, didn't recognize the person in them. A friend even suggested I'm dealing with something supernatural. I don't typically believe in such things, yet I've been plagued by a persistent, unsettling feeling whenever I'm home, which is most of the time. I can't even begin to comprehend the whole ordeal. I can only hope this is the end of it.